Well, hello, everyone. Let me welcome you. I'm Frank Fear from Future You and LA Progressive, and we're delighted to have you here with us today to talk about a very important subject, elevating eulogy virtues in a resume-driven world. And I'm delighted to have my colleague to the left, Jim Vitruba, who's going to join me today. This is going to be a joint effort, and we think it very much will be a joyful effort talking about eulogy, virtues, and using a colleague, a close colleague of ours, as the frame of reference. Jim, it's so good to see you again. We're longtime friends and colleagues. Please introduce yourself to our audience.
Thank you, Frank. It's great to be with you again. We spent some great years together at Michigan State, and it's good to be with you again. I have spent, my career is about a 50-year career. About 25 of those years have been spent in leadership roles at what I would describe as the enterprise level. I was vice provost at Michigan State, was president of Northern Kentucky University for 15 years. I've spent time on life insurance boards, on healthcare boards, and have been a student of leadership for a number of years, particularly as it relates to higher education, but not exclusively. One other thing I will share with you, as a youngster growing up in a university town, I was drawn to faculty members who could come and visit my parents and would talk about not only the impact they had on students, but the impact they were having on the world. Whether it was extending healthcare, providing breakthrough technologies, drugs to inhibit disease in developing countries. And I thought to myself, that sounds like a pretty fun place to be.
You know, Jim, one of the things that really struck me as I worked with you is that we're going to talk about our colleague Paul Miller as a frame of reference, even though as the program moves on, we're going to elevate that and talk more, just as much about what Paul's life and work was and what it means today, because Paul is no longer with us. But one of the reasons that it's just great to have you here is that you certainly are a person who in your career has reflected these eulogy virtues. And in fact, the concept of eulogy virtues and resume virtues is something that I had read David Brooks' essay in the New York Times probably about 6 or 7 years ago, but I had actually forgotten about it. And when we were talking about Paul and doing this program, you brought it up. And so maybe the place to start before we talk about Paul, his work and life, is to say a few words about what Brooks wrote about. And I know you have thought deeply about it and have extended it. So let me turn back to you.
Thank you, Frank. Yeah, I about 5 or 6 years ago, David Brooks, the op-ed writer for the New York Times, and I'm a real fan of David Brooks, wrote a book called The Road to Character. And Brooks' formulation included two sets of virtues: resume virtues, that is, those qualities that one would put on a resume, the positions held, the honors received, the recognitions awarded, the professional achievements, all those things that we use to kind of highlight what a person has accomplished. So resume virtues on the one hand and eulogy virtues on the other. Those eulogy virtues include such things as courage and honesty and integrity, empathy, commitment to values larger than ourselves. And Brooks suggests that in our culture, we put a greater emphasis on resume virtues than eulogy virtues. And that struck me because what I thought I was seeing in my own profession, which I've loved dearly, is too many examples of leaders who were willing to subordinate eulogy virtues, virtues of character and integrity, to resume virtues. What are we trying to accomplish? The other thing I would say about this is that I believe that organizational leaders, first of all, I believe that organizations express integrity as well as individuals. And I think that leaders of organizations, no matter whether they're healthcare, universities, financial services, whatever they happen to be, nonprofits, have fundamentally two responsibilities. They have to be the stewards of performance, but they also have to be the stewards of integrity. And I'm afraid that too often we subordinate the latter to the former.
Mhm. And Jim, why that's so important you make that distinction is that I think it's really fair to say that we've experienced so many failures and so many limitations of institutions, not just corporate, but also nonprofit and public, where the performance was preferred over the integrity, as you mentioned. I won't get into details, but that's the stuff of which headlines are made. And so as I thought about this, and again, you brought it up in terms of Paul's life, and we'll get into who Paul Miller was in a second here and what he accomplished. And one of the things that you'll talk about is that we're not at all dissing, so to speak, ambition. The question really is ambition for what? Toward what purpose? And Paul really exemplified ambition beyond self. How important that is today with respect to the forces which really macro forces and micro forces which compel more of an emphasis on the resume virtues than the eulogy virtues. So let's make the segue then to talk about Paul. We assume that most of the people watching this did not know Paul and may not even be familiar with his name. Who was Paul Miller, and what did he do in life, and what were, as you see, his distinguishing characteristics?
Frank, I need to begin by saying that Paul Miller was my closest professional mentor over a 40-year period. I met Paul in 1980 as part of the Kellogg Fellowship Program, National Fellowship Program. And we stayed close until his death. He was nearly 100 when he died 6 years ago. Let me describe it. Paul Miller said to me once, Jim, leadership is as much about who you are as what you do. And he kept coming back to that again and again and again. In terms of who he was, he came from rural West Virginia, a close family, not a family of means. He was a military officer, an extension agent, a graduate of West Virginia. He had a PhD in rural sociology. He was a faculty member. He became MSU, Michigan State's provost. He became West Virginia's president of his alma mater. He went from there to be undersecretary of HEW under John Gardner in the Johnson administration, and finished as president of Rochester Institute of Technology. Those were the things he was. What kind of person was he? He was an idealist with his feet planted firmly on the ground. I don't believe cynics can succeed over the long haul. Paul was an idealist and never stopped being an idealist until he took his last breath. He was humble and always open to new learning. He was affirming of others, and he believed in others and the importance of their work, and he never missed an opportunity to reinforce that. He saw the university not as an end in itself, but as a means to accomplish a broader set of social and public purposes. He believed the university was a powerful instrument for economic, democratic, and social progress. He always focused on the public good, He combined vision and action. Here's an important quality in thinking about our conversation. By disposition, Paul Miller was opportunity focused, not problem focused. It's not that he didn't understand the problems in his world, but he tended to focus on what could be built, what could be accomplished. Paul Miller was a builder. He was grounded in a set of core values, and fundamental to who he was a belief that education was powerful in its ability to transform lives, strengthen communities, and sustain democracy. He was of the university. He understood it, but he also believed in it. And he communicated that belief on a regular basis. He understood both the business of the enterprise and the practice of the enterprise, and was able to relate each of those worlds to the other. He read broadly. He was inquisitive. Paul was fundamentally a teacher. taught others using his own life. He had his own mentors. Ted Hesburgh, the president of Notre Dame, once told university leaders, do the right thing, not the politically expedient thing, not the thing that's least likely to offend donors or powerful interests. Start with doing the right thing. A second was John Gardner, a student of democracy, a believer in democracy, but also a person who one day during Paul's tenure at HEW told Paul he was going over to resign his position as secretary. And Paul said, why would you do that? And he said, I'm going to tell the president that he deserves a team that supports him, and I can no longer support the Vietnam War. Courage. A third mentor, Clark Kerr, president of the University of California. Kerr, and Paul shared this with me, Kerr once said to him, Paul, know what lines you will not cross.
Mhm.
Know what lines you will not cross. Paul was ambitious, but he was ambitious about things that were larger than himself. He was hopeful, compassionate, eloquent, sensitive, imbued with a spirit that drew others to him. And he understood the responsibility of leading around not only performance, but integrity.
Yeah.
Those are kind of who I think of when I think of the qualities that I think of with Paul. He was a dear man, a thoughtful man, and a person who, well into his 90s, had more questions than answers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. The thing that strikes me too, as you talk there, Jim, is that he came from very humble beginnings, farm family in the panhandle of West Virginia.
Yep.
One of the things he did after graduating from WVU was to work as a county ag extension agent. And the interesting thing about Paul too is that when he was making choices about what to study, if you're going to be in agriculture, it's a much easier career path if you focus on animal science or
Production
science. And he decided to focus on the people side, rural sociology. And then after he served in the war, he went to Michigan State. And I followed his career. I studied his career looking in the rearview mirror. And the meteoric rise from graduate student, master's degree, then PhD, became the first community development extension specialist at the university, then moved into continuing education, became a vice president, was extension director statewide, and then became the university's first provost, all in about a span of about 10 years, and then left for West Virginia. This was in the 50s, early 60s, and then left to become president of West Virginia in, I think, 1962. And what was interesting about Paul was that he was not only industrious and worked exceptionally hard, was very dedicated, but you mentioned the word idealist. He was a visionary. And when I study his life now, I see things that he put in place back in the early 60s that you're now seeing 30, 40, 50 years later adopted by other schools. In fact, the current president, Gordon Gee, has gone on record as saying that in many ways, Paul Miller set the foundation for what the university is doing today, multiple decades later. And then you and I have talked about this. He did a lot of visionary things in West Virginia, but then became president of Rochester Tech. It was a very different environment. It required him to essentially focus on administrative details because enrollment had fallen. There were real concerns about the future of the institution, and he had gone from a public university to a private university. And one of the things that struck me about his time at Rochester Tech is that he turned around an enrollment decline and increased it significantly in about 5 years. And I think something like 65% of the programs that were available before that he put in place that weren't there before. So he combined that vision with just feet on the ground. What do we need to do? Time's a wasting. Let's move forward.
Frank, absolutely. And that is a terrific summary, I think, of who Paul Miller was. I would only add that I think one of the risks in mature industries, and I don't care if it's healthcare, automobile industry, higher education, you name it, mature industries run the risk of losing touch with the public they serve. Paul Miller never lost touch with the people that higher education served. And I think that's one of the reasons he was so very successful as a higher education leader. RIT being, RIT, what I've heard about Paul Miller at RIT was that he transformed the institution, or I should say, it was transformed under his leadership from a technical school to a full-blown university, but always anchored in what the public needed from it. And that's one of the things that drew me to him. When you start in agriculture and you focus on the needs of the people, whether it's production or community quality of life, you start with what the public needs. And there's chapter and verse across many industries where industries lose touch with the public, and it's a slippery slope.
You know, as we make the shift now, Jim, to thinking about where we are today in today's world and the kinds of perspectives and values and virtues that we certainly share in terms of interpreting Paul's life, those become extremely important to today. As you mentioned, industries, you can experience hubris, you can be complacent and so on. But this concept of listening to the people, when you think about where Paul came from as a county extension agent, you can't impose on people at the local level. It just doesn't work. So you have to engage them, you have to listen to them, and then you need to link that to what the institution is prioritizing as important.
But you start with their world and relate yourself to their world rather than expecting them to relate themselves to your world.
Yeah.
It's just a fundamental difference.
Exactly. And so when we think about thinking beyond higher education, because that's been my world, your world,
Sure.
It was Paul's world. And I know you're doing an awful lot of work in the health industry these days. I've done work in the nonprofit area. The kinds of things we've been talking about are so critical. And I will go out on a limb and say that certainly working with you and others, I always took for granted that everything we're talking about would be the sort of, using jargon, the dominant paradigm. That was the way things were. This is the way that leaders thought. This is the way we would proceed. And then I experienced over, especially the last 25 years of my career till today, that is in much shorter supply. And I would go so far as to say, and I would appreciate your response, supplanted by what some people refer to as neoliberalism, other people refer to as market forces, but this incessant focus on winning, do what it takes to compete and win. And as you said earlier, focus on performance. And so the integrity virtues, as you mentioned earlier, either are in shorter supply or in some cases get sacrificed.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I worry today that we are becoming a much more cynical world and a much more transactional world than the world in which I grew up. I think it is. I think we are quite willing to subordinate far too often. Not everyone. I mean, we could spend the rest of our time together, Frank, talking about the heroes, and there are a ton of them, and I remain hopeful around that. But I'm afraid that we live in an era when cynicism seems to me to hold larger sway than it should, a world in which we've lost our ability to advance big ideas, a world that focuses more on me than we, and Brooks talks about that as well. In a world in which we celebrate performance without any consideration of how that performance was achieved. That is a big concern. And I think, Frank, you and I grew up assuming that democracy was a given. And last evening, Rachel, my wife, and I were at dinner with two other couples, and we got talking about that, all of them of our generation, saying, yes, that's the way we grew up as well, but I feel less confident at this point. And we ought to be concerned about that. Paul Miller once said to me, Jim, when you have big decisions to make, think about which mistake is easier to live with. And in matters concerning the future of our nation and our democratic government, we better not make the wrong decision, because it would be hard to live with.
Yeah, so well stated. And one of the reasons, just for the audience to know that we're doing this video, is it's too easy to say, oh, gee, people like Paul Miller, Jim Vitruva, Frank Fear, others, that's old school.
Yeah.
That's not the way the world is today. And that what we all need to do is adjust to the way the world is. And I've had conversations like that in there. It's not that language is not expressed in a negative way. It simply says the world's changed and you need to change with it. And I think that I know our feeling is what we need to do is to talk about people like Paul Miller and to be able to celebrate, not only celebrate his life, because you and I both, I think, by going through thinking about and chatting about Paul, our appreciation for him has deepened. But to say, look, we all know people today, as you said, tons of people who are very much driven by these eulogy virtues.
Right.
And the fact of the matter is we need to upshift. We need to see more of that. And if we talk about it and show examples of it and celebrate it, we have much more of a fighting chance than simply saying, it's old school, the world has changed, so therefore just adjust, make the pivot and move on.
And Frank, to emphasize something you said a moment ago, this is not to deny the importance of ambition.
That's right.
I mean, some of the greatest leaders I've known have been terrifically ambitious people, but ambitious on behalf of ideas and institutions, less so on behalf of their own resume virtues.
That's right.
And that was Paul Miller. And I worry about that as well. You know, all of us are dated in some respects, right? We're creatures of our own time. Sometimes I have to step back and ask myself, are you responding to whatever because it's the right response or because you're just coming at it from a different era? And sometimes I answer that, you're coming at this from a different era. Back off and be patient and learn what's being said. But I do think that some of the qualities that Paul exuded were qualities that are timeless. And I am so concerned that too often we are allowing performance to transcend integrity. Frank, you and I have talked about this in the world of higher education. Athletics can be one of those areas. The pressure to perform can transcend our willingness to treat athletes and coaches with a different set of standards, and it should never be the case. And one can't, once one begins to compromise on the eulogy side, it's pretty tough to back out of that.
Yeah. Oh, very well stated. I agree completely. And another thing I want to say as we wind down here is that by talking about Paul, talking about his life, talking about our own leadership, we're really talking about a set of ideas, of concepts, of really some choice making. What we're not doing is saying, if you look at our careers, we've always made the right choices, always have done the right thing. It's always a struggle, there's no question. But at the same time, you look at a pattern over time, and it's the pattern we're concerned about, and it's the future in relationship to what seems to be dominating today, and what perhaps is not as emphasized as it once was.
That's what I wish leaders would spend more time thinking about. And I think, frankly, as we prepare leaders, the next generation of leaders, this conversation has to occur.
Yeah. Any final comments you want to make before we bid our audience goodbye?
Well, Frank, I think I would just finish with a couple of thoughts in terms of my good friend Paul Miller. Paul Miller taught me a couple of things. Taught me to be humble and always open to new learning. He taught me to have courage. He taught me to be ambitious on behalf of those whom we serve. He taught me to identify the right thing and then have the courage to do it. Know what lines you won't cross. Believe in those whom you're sharing a journey with and express that belief every day. The power of belief in my view, cannot be overstated. We could use more Paul Millers these days. And Frank Fear, we can use more people just like you who are willing to hold institutions as well as people accountable.
Thank you, Jim. You know, as you were talking, I was thinking about an observation you made earlier. It'll be my closing comment. As for all of you, Paul wrote a book at the end of his life, his memoir, and I've really enjoyed reading it. And one of the things he wrote, and actually was in a speech in 1995, he said, you know, when we think about ourselves as educators, when we think about ourselves as leaders, and I would emphasize the leader, there's a choice, and it's, do we emphasize the me or do we emphasize the we? And he made a comment that I found stunning in relationship to where we are in society today. And he said, you know, the biggest challenge we have in the social world is that we have people who are generally driven by what's best for me. And there are other people who focus on what's best for we, the Commonwealth. And then the last sentence, I'm not going to forget. And he said, he didn't pick one over the other. The point he concluded in his speech was, the big question is, how can we live together? Which means, how can we understand each other?
And has that ever been more relevant a question than it is today?
And that starts, as you said, with a very important issue, listening. You cannot live together unless you understand the other. And all one has to do is just go to their Facebook feed, and you see that in very, very short supply, listening and understanding. Wow.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Jim, I've enjoyed this. Always good seeing you again, working with you, and to celebrate Paul's life, but also to view Paul's life in a much broader perspective in terms of what it means for today and the hopefulness for tomorrow. So thank you very much, my good friend.
You bet, Frank. Thank you.
For Jim Vitruba, I'm Frank Fear, and we hope to see you again very, very soon.